Marta Hoffman had never imagined her life would follow such an ordinary pattern, yet she found comfort in that predictability. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a mid-sized medical supply company based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Her weekdays involved visiting clinics and small hospitals across the region, presenting product catalogs and negotiating bulk orders with procurement managers. The work demanded steady attention but rarely brought unexpected challenges. She drove the same routes, visited the same facilities, and maintained relationships with the same group of medical professionals year after year. Her husband, Lucas Hoffman, managed a mid-level event coordination business specializing in corporate gatherings and private celebrations. His office occupied a modest commercial space near the business district, where he handled bookings, supplier contracts, and scheduling logistics. The business required constant phone calls, last-minute adjustments, and frequent evening meetings with clients who could only meet after standard work hours. Lucas often described the work as demanding but rewarding, though he rarely elaborated on specific difficulties beyond mentioning seasonal fluctuations in demand. Their home sat in a quiet subdivision built during the previous decade, where streets curved gently past uniform brick houses with small front lawns and attached garages. Neighbors acknowledged each other politely, but maintained distance, creating an atmosphere of friendly detachment common in newer suburban developments. Marta and Lucas had purchased the house for years into their marriage, viewing it as a necessary step toward stability rather than a dream fulfilled. Most evenings followed a similar rhythm. Marta returned from work around 6, while Lucas arrived anywhere between 7 and 9, depending on client meetings. They prepared simple dinners together or picked up takeout from nearby restaurants. Conversation during meals covered routine topics, upcoming appointments, household repairs, bills that needed attention, and vague plans to take a vacation they never quite scheduled. Neither of them pushed for deeper discussions. Their communication functioned adequately without requiring emotional intensity. Weekends offered slightly more variation. They occasionally attended local farmers markets, browsed home improvement stores considering projects they postponed indefinitely, or watched movies at home while sharing a bottle of wine. Lucas preferred action films, while Marta leaned toward documentaries, so they alternated selections without argument. Friends from Lucas's business network sometimes invited them to gatherings, which they attended when convenient. Marta noticed that Lucas seemed more animated at these events, engaging easily in conversations about industry trends and sharing anecdotes from difficult clients. She participated less actively, answering questions when addressed but rarely initiating exchanges. Their marriage lacked dramatic conflicts but also lacked particular warmth. They never argued loudly or criticized each other harshly. Instead, they existed alongside one another, fulfilling practical roles without investing significant emotional energy. Marta sometimes wondered if other couples experienced marriage similarly, as a functional arrangement built on shared responsibilities rather than ongoing connection. She did not consider this problematic, merely factual. Lucas maintained certain habits that Marta accepted as part of his personality. He spent considerable time reviewing contracts and responding to emails late into the evening, often working from the dining table with his laptop open and papers spread across the surface. He kept his phone within reach constantly, checking messages frequently even during meals. Marta attributed this behavior to the nature of his business, where clients expected quick responses and availability outside normal hours. Another consistent pattern involved his Friday nights. Lucas regularly attended what he called networking events at various venues around Charlotte, gatherings organized by business associations or informal groups of event coordinators and vendors. He explained that maintaining visibility in the industry required showing up, making connections, and staying current with emerging trends. These outings typically lasted several hours, and he returned home late, sometimes after midnight. Marta never questioned these absences. They seemed entirely reasonable given his professional circumstances. Financially, they maintained a comfortable but unremarkable situation. Both earned steady incomes that covered their mortgage, car payments, utilities, and modest discretionary spending. They contributed to retirement accounts and maintained an emergency fund, following conventional financial advice without particular enthusiasm or anxiety. Lucas handled most of the business finances separately, mentioning occasional slow months or unexpected expenses, but never in ways that suggested serious concern. Marta noticed Lucas carried a particular briefcase everywhere, a worn leather case that showed years of use. He kept it locked and stored it in his car trunk when not actively working. Once, when she casually asked what made it necessary to lock, he replied that client contracts contained confidential information and that maintaining professional boundaries required careful handling of documents. The explanation made sense, and she thought nothing more of it. Their intimate life had settled into infrequent routine. Physical affection occurred sporadically, initiated without particular passion and concluded without memorable intensity. Neither of them complained or suggested changes. Marta assumed this represented normal progression in long-term relationships, where initial excitement naturally diminished into comfortable coexistence. Looking back later, Marta would struggle to identify the exact moment when normalcy began shifting into something else. The change happened gradually, accumulating in small increments that only became visible when viewed collectively. But during those months, living inside the daily pattern, she perceived nothing alarming. Life continued moving forward in its established direction, and she had no reason to suspect the foundation beneath that predictable existence was already fracturing. The changes began so subtly that Marta initially dismissed them as temporary stress. Lucas started spending longer hours at his laptop, but his focus seemed different. Previously, he worked with methodical efficiency, completing tasks and closing the computer. Now, he kept multiple browser tabs open, switching between screens rapidly whenever she entered the room. His fingers moved across the keyboard with urgent purpose, yet he produced no clear results she could observe. When she asked casual questions about his workload, his responses grew shorter. He mentioned challenging clients, shifting industry demands, and complications with vendor relationships, but never provided specific details. The vagueness struck her as unusual for someone who typically enjoyed discussing business strategies. She tried asking more directly once, inquiring whether particular problems needed attention, but he responded with mild irritation, suggesting she was overthinking normal work fluctuations. His phone became a constant presence in ways it had not been before. During dinner, it sat face down beside his plate, vibrating periodically with incoming messages. He glanced at the screen frequently, sometimes mid-conversation, his attention visibly splitting between her words and whatever appeared on the display. When she pointed out the distraction, he apologized quickly, but continued the behavior. The phone accompanied him everywhere now, even into the bathroom, something she found peculiar but did not challenge. Financial comments increased in frequency. Lucas mentioned rising operational costs, delayed client payments, and unexpected equipment expenses. He suggested postponing their vague vacation plans and cutting back on non-essential purchases. Marta agreed without resistance, assuming temporary business difficulties. However, she noticed he provided no timeline for when conditions might improve. The concerns hovered indefinitely, neither resolving nor escalating into crisis. His Friday networking events expanded. Instead of attending once weekly, Lucas now mentioned commitments 2 or 3 times per week. The events supposedly included industry mixers, vendor showcases, and informal gatherings at various lounges and restaurants. He left around 8 in the evening and returned well past midnight, sometimes closer to 2 in the morning. The pattern repeated consistently enough that Marta stopped waiting up for him. She would hear the garage door opening in the early hours, followed by the sound of him moving quietly through the house before settling into bed. One Saturday morning, after he returned particularly late the night before, Marta asked whether these gatherings genuinely required such extended hours. Lucas explained that meaningful connections happened after formal events ended, during casual conversations that extended naturally. He emphasized that competitors who left early missed valuable opportunities. His tone carried defensive certainty that discouraged further questioning. The locked briefcase remained a fixture. Marta observed him transferring it from his car to his office and back again with careful attention. Once, she noticed papers inside when he opened it briefly, documents covered with dense text in numerical columns. Before she could focus clearly, he closed it and reset the combination lock. When she commented that he seemed particularly protective of the case, he replied that confidentiality agreements with clients required strict document security. The explanation sounded professional and reasonable. His physical presence at home diminished even when he was physically present. He spent increasing time in their spare bedroom, which he had converted into a home office. The door remained closed for hours while he worked inside. Marta could hear him making phone calls, his voice low and controlled, occasionally rising with emphasis before dropping again. She could not distinguish words clearly through the door, only tone and rhythm. The conversations seemed urgent but contained. Their conversations thinned into exchanges of practical information. They discussed grocery lists, appointment schedules, and household maintenance needs. Deeper topics disappeared entirely. Marta could not recall the last time they had discussed future plans, personal feelings, or anything beyond immediate logistics. The absence of substance did not register as alarming initially. Many couples settled into functional communication patterns. Only later would she recognize this as evidence of active withdrawal rather than natural evolution. Sleep patterns shifted noticeably. Lucas stayed awake later, often still working on his laptop at 1 or 2 in the morning. Some nights she woke to find him sitting in the living room, staring at his phone screen in darkness, the blue light illuminating his face. When she asked if something was wrong, he claimed he could not sleep and was catching up on emails. The explanation seemed plausible given his workload, yet something about his expression suggested deeper preoccupation. Mail began accumulating unopened. Envelopes from banks, insurance companies, and official agencies collected on the kitchen counter. Marta mentioned them several times, noting that some appeared time-sensitive. Lucas glanced at the pile and promised to handle them soon, but weeks passed without action. When she offered to help sort through correspondence, he declined sharply, stating he preferred managing business matters independently. The reaction seemed disproportionate to her simple offer. His appetite decreased noticeably. Meals she prepared went partially eaten, and he frequently claimed he was not hungry or had eaten earlier. His clothes began fitting differently, hanging looser around his frame. When she expressed concern about his health, he attributed the weight loss to work stress and promised to eat better once current projects stabilized. The assurance carried no conviction. Marta tried adjusting her approach, giving him more space and reducing questions, hoping the distance would allow whatever pressure he felt to ease naturally. She maintained household routines, completed her own work responsibilities, and avoided creating additional demands on his time. She believed patience would eventually restore their equilibrium. She did not realize she was watching carefully planned preparation rather than temporary difficulty. The final weeks before everything changed intensified these patterns without introducing new ones. Lucas simply became more of what he already was, absent while present, preoccupied beyond reach, and increasingly separate from their shared life. Marta adapted by lowering expectations and accepting a new normal that felt hollow but stable. She convinced herself this phase would pass, that marriages naturally included periods of disconnection, and that persistent effort would eventually bring him back. She was wrong. The evening Lucas disappeared began with the same routine that had become familiar. He mentioned a networking event at a downtown venue, a gathering organized by a regional events industry association. The location was a nightclub called Pulse, a mid-tier establishment that hosted private functions during weekday evenings, before opening to general crowds later at night. Lucas explained that the event would run from 8 until around 11, followed by optional socializing afterward. Marta was reading in the living room when he prepared to leave. He wore dark jeans and a collared shirt, casual but presentable. He checked his phone, grabbed his keys, and kissed her forehead briefly before heading out. His manner carried no unusual tension, no indication that anything differed from countless previous departures. He said he would be home late and suggested she not wait up. The door closed behind him with ordinary finality. Around midnight, Marta's phone rang. The caller identified himself as a Charlotte Fire Department battalion chief. His voice maintained professional calm as he asked whether she was related to Lucas Hoffman. When she confirmed, he explained that a significant fire had occurred at Pulse Nightclub earlier that evening. Emergency crews had responded to reports of smoke and flames originating from the building's electrical system. The fire spread rapidly through aging infrastructure, triggering evacuation procedures. The chief explained that most attendees evacuated successfully, but chaos during the emergency made accountability difficult. Several individuals remained unaccounted for hours after the incident. Lucas Hoffman appeared on the venue's guest list for the private event, but officials had not confirmed his safe exit. The chief asked whether Marta had heard from her husband since the fire began. She had not. Officers arrived at her house within the hour. They asked standard questions: what time Lucas left, what he was wearing, whether he had mentioned meeting specific people, whether he had health conditions that might affect his ability to evacuate quickly. Marta answered mechanically, her thoughts struggling to organize around the information. The officers explained that search teams were working through the damaged structure systematically, checking for anyone who might have been trapped or overcome by smoke. She spent that night alternating between her phone and the television news, which showed aerial footage of the nightclub surrounded by emergency vehicles. The building's facade showed significant fire damage, with broken windows and charred walls visible even in darkness. Reporters interviewed witnesses who described confusion, thick smoke, and people pushing toward exits. Nobody mentioned seeing Lucas specifically. By dawn, authorities had completed their initial search of the structure. They found one deceased individual in a back corridor near what had been the building's rear service area. The body was severely burned, making immediate visual identification impossible. Personal effects in the vicinity included fragments of a wallet and a phone, both too damaged for easy confirmation. Dental records and DNA analysis would be required for positive identification. Detectives visited Marta again that afternoon. They showed her photographs of items recovered near the body, charred leather remnants that might have been a wallet, metal fragments from a belt buckle, and the melted remains of a watch. The watch bore some similarity to one Lucas owned, a simple steel model with a dark face. Marta confirmed he had been wearing it when he left. The detectives noted her response carefully, but stressed that formal identification required scientific confirmation. The following week moved slowly. Marta contacted Lucas's family in Germany, explaining what authorities had told her. His mother's voice broke repeatedly during the call. His younger brother offered to fly over, but Marta suggested waiting until confirmation arrived. She notified his business associates and clients, using careful language that acknowledged uncertainty while preparing them for likely news. Dental records provided the first strong indicator. The deceased individual's dental structure matched Lucas's records with significant probability, though some damage complicated absolute certainty. DNA analysis followed, comparing tissue samples against reference material from Lucas's hairbrush. Results returned 10 days after the fire. The genetic match confirmed identity conclusively. The body recovered from Pulse Nightclub was Lucas Hoffman. The medical examiner determined cause of death as smoke inhalation combined with thermal injuries. The report indicated he likely became disoriented in the smoke-filled corridor and moved away from exits rather than toward them. The manner of death was ruled accidental, consistent with other nightclub fire fatalities where panic and poor visibility caused tragic navigation errors. Marta arranged a small funeral service 3 weeks after the fire. The casket remained closed due to the condition of the remains. Approximately 40 people attended, mostly Lucas's business contacts and a few neighbors. The pastor delivering remarks had never met Lucas and relied on generic statements about loss and memory. Marta sat in the front row, accepting condolences from people whose faces blurred together. She felt detached from the proceedings, as though watching events happen to someone else. In the months following, she functioned on automatic. She continued working, driving familiar routes and maintaining professional interactions without revealing internal numbness. At home, she moved through rooms that felt simultaneously empty and crowded with reminders. She left Lucas's belongings largely untouched, unable to decide what discarding them would mean. The fire investigation concluded that faulty electrical wiring in the building's older sections had sparked the blaze. The nightclub's owners faced citations for safety violations and eventually settled multiple lawsuits from victims' families. Marta received a settlement payment 18 months later. The amount felt arbitrary and meaningless. She never reviewed Lucas's business records thoroughly. His laptop remained in the home office, password protected. The locked briefcase stayed in his car, which he eventually sold to a dealership without opening the trunk. She did not seek access to his phone records or bank accounts beyond what was necessary for settling his estate. Some part of her did not want to know what he had been doing during those final months. Grief felt simpler than complicated truth. 6 years passed in this suspended state. Marta existed rather than lived, performing necessary functions while avoiding deeper engagement. She told herself this was normal grief, that healing required time she had not yet accumulated. She did not expect anything to change. Then she traveled to Miami for a pharmaceutical conference, and everything she believed about those 6 years shattered in a single moment. The pharmaceutical conference occupied 3 days in mid-March at a downtown Miami hotel. Marta attended primarily because her company required sales representatives to maintain continuing education credits. The sessions covered new drug formulations, regulatory updates, and sales techniques she had heard variations of countless times. She participated minimally, sitting toward the back of conference rooms and taking notes that served no real purpose. On the second evening, after a particularly long day of presentations, she declined an invitation to join colleagues for drinks. Instead, she walked out of the hotel seeking air and distance from the crowded convention spaces. The evening was warm, with pedestrians moving casually along sidewalks lined with restaurants and retail shops. She walked without destination, letting the unfamiliar surroundings distract her from routine thoughts. After 20 minutes, she found herself on a street filled with outdoor dining establishments. Small tables occupied sidewalk spaces, separated from foot traffic by decorative planters and low barriers. She chose a restaurant called Marisol, attracted by its quiet atmosphere and available seating. A hostess guided her to a table near the edge of the outdoor section, positioned where she could observe both the restaurant interior and passing street activity. She ordered a glass of wine and scanned the menu without interest. Around her, other diners engaged in animated conversations, their voices blending into ambient noise. She sipped her wine slowly, grateful for the anonymity of being alone in a city where nobody knew her. Then, she saw him. The recognition happened in stages, each one building certainty. First, she noticed a man standing near the restaurant's interior entrance, speaking with a hostess. His posture registered immediately, the slight forward lean, the way he gestured with his right hand while keeping his left at his side. Her breath caught before conscious thought formed. He turned slightly, bringing his profile into view. The shape of his jaw, the angle of his nose, the particular way his hair grew above his ear. Everything aligned with images burned into her memory. Her wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth. A woman approached him, younger than Marta, with dark hair pulled into a loose bun. She carried a small boy, perhaps 3 years old, who wrapped arms around her neck. The man smiled at them, reaching out to touch the child's back with unmistakable familiarity. The gesture was gentle, paternal, entirely natural. The hostess led them toward a table deeper inside the restaurant. As they moved, the man's face came into full view under the interior lighting. There was no resemblance, no similarity. It was him, Lucas, older, heavier, with a beard she had never seen him wear, but absolutely, undeniably him. Marta's heart hammered against her ribs. Her vision narrowed, focusing exclusively on the 3 figures settling into their seats. The woman helped the boy into a high chair, while Lucas arranged menus and spoke words Marta could not hear. His movements carried the same efficiency she remembered, economical and purposeful. For several seconds she could not move. Her mind struggled to reconcile the dead man she had buried with the living person sitting 30 feet away, laughing at something the woman said while handing a crayon to the child. The logical impossibility collided with sensory certainty. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against concrete. Other diners glanced at her. She did not notice. She moved toward the restaurant entrance, threading between tables with singular focus. Her hands trembled. Her breathing came shallow and rapid. As she reached the interior dining area, Lucas looked up from the menu. Their eyes met directly. His expression changed instantly, color draining from his face. For one suspended moment they stared at each other across the restaurant, mutual recognition absolute. Then he turned away sharply, saying something urgent to the woman beside him. She looked confused. He stood quickly, placing money on the table and reaching for the child. The woman protested, gesturing at their barely arrived situation, but Lucas insisted with visible agitation. He lifted the boy from the high chair and moved toward a rear exit, the woman following with bewildered concern. Marta pushed through the restaurant, ignoring a server who asked if she needed assistance. By the time she reached the back exit, it opened onto an alley already empty except for commercial dumpsters and parked delivery vehicles. She stepped outside, scanning both directions. Nothing. They had vanished into Miami's evening crowds. She stood in the alley for several minutes, her entire body shaking. Slowly, practical thought returned. She pulled out her phone and photographed the alley, the restaurant's rear entrance, anything that might help her remember precise details. She opened her notes application and typed frantically, Marisol Restaurant, Miami, March 17th, 8:47 p.m. Lucas Hoffman, alive, with woman and child, fled when recognized. She returned through the restaurant, stopping at the hostess stand. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears as she asked whether the hostess remembered the man with the woman and child who had just left suddenly. The hostess recalled them, but knew nothing beyond their reservation name, Becker, party of 3. No other information. Marta walked back to her hotel in a daze, the warm Miami night feeling surreal and distant. In her room, she sat on the bed and stared at the notes on her phone, reading them repeatedly to confirm they were real and not products of exhausted imagination. Lucas was alive. He had not died in the fire. He had left deliberately, built a new life, and constructed a family while she spent 6 years believing him gone. Marta did not sleep that night. She sat against the hotel headboard, staring at her phone screen, replaying the moment their eyes met. The image repeated with brutal clarity, his face draining of color, the instant recognition, the panicked retreat. There was no mistaking what had happened. He had seen her and fled. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would not return to Charlotte until she found concrete proof. Grief could not be trusted, shock distorted perception, but evidence was objective. She needed something undeniable. After the conference sessions ended that afternoon, she returned to Marisol Restaurant. The lunch shift hostess was different from the previous evening. Marta explained she was trying to locate someone she had seen dining there, describing Lucas, the woman, and the child. The hostess consulted reservation records and confirmed a party under the name. Becker had booked a table for 8:30 p.m. the previous night, but had left shortly after arrival without ordering. Marta asked whether the reservation included contact information. The hostess stated that policy prevented sharing customer details. However, she added that most reservations came through an online platform that required phone numbers. She could not provide the number, but confirmed one existed in their system. Marta walked the surrounding blocks methodically, showing Lucas's old photograph on her phone to restaurant staff, shop employees, and building security personnel. Most showed polite disinterest. One security guard outside a residential tower studied the photo longer than others. He said the man looked somewhat familiar, possibly a resident, though he could not be certain. When Marta pressed for details, he refused, citing privacy regulations. She returned to the tower after the guard's shift ended. A different security employee manned the desk. Marta approached with a fabricated story about trying to locate her brother who had moved to Miami, but whose exact address she had lost. She showed the photograph. The guard examined it briefly and shook his head, stating he could not confirm or deny resident identities. Frustrated but not defeated, Marta positioned herself across the street from the building. She waited for 3 hours, watching people enter and exit. As evening approached, she finally saw them. The woman from the restaurant emerged pushing a stroller, the small boy walking beside her. Lucas was not with them, but their presence confirmed the building connection. Marta followed at a distance as they walked to a nearby park. She photographed them discreetly, capturing clear images of the woman and child. When they returned to the building 40 minutes later, she watched them enter through the main lobby, noting the floor indicator stopping on the 8th level. That evening, she used public records databases accessible online. She searched Miami-Dade County property and rental records, filtering by the building address and cross-referencing with the name Becker. One result appeared. Marcus Becker, listed as a tenant in Unit 814. The record included a scanned copy of the lease agreement with a signature. She enlarged the signature on her phone screen. The handwriting matched Lucas's distinctive style, the particular way he formed the letter M and the sharp angle of his K. She had seen his signature on countless documents throughout their marriage. This was his handwriting applied to a false name. Further searching revealed Marcus Becker held a Florida driver's license issued 4 years earlier. The database did not include photographs, but confirmed the license was active. She also found business registration records showing Marcus Becker as owner of a small event planning consultancy operating from the same residential address. The evidence accumulated into undeniable conclusion. Lucas had not died in the Charlotte nightclub fire. He had staged his disappearance, assumed a false identity, relocated to Miami, started a business, and built a family with another woman. The dead body identified through dental and DNA evidence had been someone else, someone whose identity remained unknown. Marta compiled everything she had gathered: photographs from the restaurant and park, screenshots of public records, lease documents, business registrations, and detailed written accounts of both sightings. She organized the materials into a single digital folder and backed it up across multiple platforms. The next morning she flew back to Charlotte and drove directly to the police department. She requested to speak with detectives handling cold cases or fraud investigations. After a 2-hour wait, 2 detectives interviewed her in a small conference room. She presented her evidence methodically, walking them through each discovery step by step. The detectives listened with increasing attention. When she finished, they asked clarifying questions about the fire investigation, the identification process used 6 years earlier, and the certainty of her Miami sighting. Marta answered each question precisely, providing dates, times, and specific details that demonstrated credibility. One detective made phone calls while the other reviewed her documentation. They explained that if her account proved accurate, Lucas had committed multiple serious crimes: identity fraud, insurance fraud, falsification related to a death investigation, and potentially financial crimes connected to his business closure. Within 48 hours, Charlotte detectives coordinated with Miami law enforcement. They verified the residential address, confirmed Marcus Becker's existence in local databases, and obtained security footage from the building. The footage showed a man matching Lucas's description entering and exiting regularly, often with the woman and child Marta had observed. Detectives also reopened the nightclub fire investigation. They reviewed the original identification records and discovered significant irregularities. The DNA reference sample, supposedly from Lucas's hairbrush, had been processed through a lab that later faced accreditation questions. The dental match, while initially deemed probable, contained enough ambiguity that alternative conclusions were possible if examined skeptically. Most significantly, financial records from the weeks before the fire revealed systematic withdrawals from Lucas's business accounts, totaling nearly $80,000. The money had been converted to cashier's checks and withdrawn in ways designed to avoid triggering reporting requirements. The pattern suggested deliberate preparation rather than routine business activity. 3 weeks after Marta's report, Miami police arrested Marcus Becker outside his apartment building. He did not resist. When Miami police detained the man calling himself Marcus Becker, they transported him to a local precinct for processing. Standard fingerprint analysis confirmed what Marta already knew. The prints matched those on file for Lucas Hoffman, taken years earlier during a routine background check for business licensing. The man sitting in the interrogation room was legally and biologically Lucas Hoffman, officially declared dead 6 years prior. Charlotte detectives arrived in Miami within 48 hours. They interviewed Lucas extensively, though he invoked his right to legal representation quickly and said little beyond confirming his true identity. His attorney, a Miami criminal defense lawyer, advised complete silence regarding how he had staged the disappearance or whose body had been identified in his place. Investigators reopened the nightclub fire case with new urgency. They re-examined evidence from the scene and discovered that the deceased individual had been carrying identification documents, later determined to be sophisticated forgeries. The real victim's identity eventually emerged through alternative investigative channels: a homeless man named Christopher Wade, who had been reported missing by a shelter operator around the same time as the fire. Wade had been approximately the same height and build as Lucas, and dental records suggested he had received inconsistent dental care that complicated initial matching attempts. Detectives theorized that Lucas had encountered Wade, possibly offering money or assistance, and had provided him with forged documents bearing Lucas's name. When the fire began, Wade died in the chaos while carrying identification that pointed to Lucas. Whether Lucas had anticipated the fire or simply exploited an unexpected opportunity remained unclear. The evidence supported both possibilities without confirming either. The woman living with Lucas in Miami, identified as Sandra Reeves, gave a statement to investigators expressing complete shock. She testified that she had met Marcus Becker 4 years earlier through a community recreational sports league. He had presented himself as a widower whose wife had died in a car accident. He worked in event planning, kept regular hours, and demonstrated consistent stability. They had dated for 18 months before moving in together. Their son was born 2 years into their relationship. She'd never suspected he was living under a false identity, or that another family existed in his past. Prosecutors charged Lucas with identity fraud, insurance fraud related to a life insurance policy Marta had collected, falsification of death records, and financial crimes connected to business debts he had evaded through his disappearance. The case proceeded through pretrial proceedings over several months before reaching trial. The courtroom proceedings were methodical and emotionally restrained. Prosecutors presented financial records showing Lucas's mounting business debts in the months before his disappearance, totaling over $200,000 from unpaid vendor contracts and defaulted business loans. They demonstrated systematic asset liquidation and careful withdrawal of funds in the weeks preceding the fire. They showed how he had obtained false identity documents and established the Marcus Becker persona before the Nightclub incident occurred. Marta testified about the final months of their marriage, describing behavioral changes and increasing secrecy. She recounted recognizing him in Miami with precision that left no room for reasonable doubt. Sandra Reeves testified about the life Lucas had constructed in Miami, inadvertently highlighting the elaborate deception he had maintained for years. Lucas's defense attempted to introduce claims of severe psychological distress, arguing he had experienced a mental breakdown that impaired judgment. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluations contradicted this narrative. Experts found him mentally competent, capable of complex planning, and aware of legal and moral implications of his actions throughout the relevant period. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Lucas stood and spoke briefly. He said he had felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control and believed disappearing was the only solution to insurmountable problems. He expressed regret for harm caused, but offered no detailed explanation of his reasoning or planning. His statement lasted less than 2 minutes. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges after 3 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Lucas to 12 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole only after serving a minimum of 8 years. Additional restitution orders required him to repay the life insurance settlement Marta had received, along with other costs associated with the false investigation. Marta attended the sentencing but left immediately afterward. She drove back to Charlotte and returned to work the following week. Colleagues who knew about the case asked how she felt. She gave brief, neutral responses that discouraged deeper conversation. She sold the house she had shared with Lucas and moved to a smaller apartment across town. She disposed of his remaining belongings without ceremony, donating most items to charity and discarding the rest. The locked briefcase, eventually opened by investigators, had contained detailed financial records documenting the full extent of his business collapse and careful notes about establishing a new identity. 6 months after the trial, Marta received a letter from Sandra Reeves. It was brief and formal, apologizing for unknowingly participating in deception and expressing hope that Marta could find peace. Marta read it once and filed it away without responding. There was nothing useful to say. Years accumulated slowly. Marta continued working, maintained minimal social connections, and lived with careful emotional boundaries. She did not date or pursue new relationships. When people asked about her past, she offered simple, factual explanations that prevented follow-up questions. She thought about Lucas occasionally, not with anger or longing, but with persistent bewilderment. She never understood what combination of fear, selfishness, or desperation drove someone to abandon their life so completely. The trial had provided legal resolution, but no psychological clarity. She accepted that some questions have no satisfying answers, and that closure is not always achievable. She learned to live in that uncertainty, moving forward not because she had healed completely, but because continuing was the only practical option. Life, she understood finally, did not require a resolution to continue. It simply continued, regardless of what remained unfinished.